so much for braving the cold weather to join us tonight. Our guest this evening is Professor Jordan Peterson. Jordan is a professor at the University of Toronto, a clinical psychologist, and the author of 12 Rules for Life, which has been a #1 bestseller in the US, Canada, the UK, Australia, New Zealand, Sweden, the Netherlands, and Brazil. He rose to international prominence in 2016 after criticizing the Canadian government's enactment of Bill C-16. Please join me in welcoming Professor Peterson with a warm round of applause. So thank you very much for joining us tonight, Jordan. I've had a lovely time in Cambridge so far. So I guess just to kick
better looking crowd than those Oxford louts.
That's exactly what we like to hear. So just to kick things off, you've had a very rapid rise to fame. How is this going to change, or is it changing the way you discuss your beliefs or debate controversial issues?
Well, it's made me more careful. I mean, I was careful to begin with, but especially in the first, say, year of this, it's been 2 years now that I've been under intense scrutiny, let's say. There was a lot of precarious moments during that period of time, especially at the beginning. And so I've watched what I say even more carefully. I started doing that when I was about 25, thereabouts, listening to what I was saying and feeling it out and trying to make sure that each word was like if you're crossing a swamp, you know, you might feel out to see where if you knew there was a submerged pathway, you might feel out where the solid ground is, and each word can be like that when you make your way through life. But you have to pay very careful attention to what you say, and I started to learn to do that, but the necessity for that became even greater when I was under increased scrutiny, especially, you know, for a while my job was on the line, and with that would have gone my clinical practice and my reputation. And so it's just made me more, well, hopefully more awake. That would be a good outcome. So, and it's possible that that's happened. So far, I'm still here. So that's some testament to being awake.
And in terms of sort of the care you have with your words, I noticed that was sort of one of your sort of 12 rules. Was that in light of your sort of post-fame or pre-fame?
No, it was a consequence of something I discovered when I wrote my first book, which was called Maps of Meaning, which was that there's an old doctrine, and it's been formalized, I suppose, in its most articulate form in Christianity, but it's a very, very old idea, that words create the world. And I believe that that's a metaphorical statement in some sense, because what it means in its most fundamental manner isn't something we can fully fathom, but I believe that it's true. And so that if you want to create a world that isn't hellish, then you use words that are as clear and precise and honest as you can possibly manage, because it is through your speech that the possibilities of the world transform themselves into the realities of the world. So, and when I understood that mostly as a consequence of studying totalitarianism and what went so dreadfully wrong in Nazi Germany and mostly in the Soviet Union. Although I did some investigation into Maoist China and other places like that, I understood that a huge causal role was played by injudicious and malevolent use of language. So I thought, well, I don't want to contribute to that at all, in even the smallest amount. And so I decided that I was going to be very careful with what I said and wrote. So I've been practicing that for 30 years, diligently. So
thank you very much for that then. Moving on, the notion sort of that certain behaviors and trends which differ between men and women are caused by the social construct is quite a prevalent view now. Is it possible to prove or disprove this using tools in psychology?
Well, it's true that many of the differences between men and women are socially constructed, because many of the differences between people are socially constructed. Obviously, we're very malleable. We have an extraordinarily long dependency period, and we learn all sorts of things. And so the issue is never whether the behavioral differences between men and women, the psychological differences, are socially constructed. That isn't the claim of the social, that isn't the claim that I'm attempting to dispute to the degree I'm disputing it. The claim of the radical social constructionists is that all of it's socially constructed. Well, that's wrong. It's simply wrong. And it's not only wrong, but it's wrong in a variety of extremely dangerous ways. So, for example, the social science with regards to the psychological differences, well, let's say, first of all, that we'd admit that certain morphological differences between men and women aren't socially constructed. If we can't agree on that, then we're not going to get anywhere. And then some more subtle biological differences on top of that. And then we might say, well, biological differences shade imperceptibly into psychological differences, since the psyche has a biological grounding. And so there's going to be psychological differences that are influenced by biology. And what are they? Well, we know what they are. There's temperamental differences between men and women, according to the best psychometric instruments we have for assessing personality, which are among the most reliable and valid measures in all of the social sciences. And those differences are not overwhelming, but they're significant. And not only that, and this is the crucial, absolutely crucial issue, as your culture becomes richer and more egalitarian, those differences grow. And so what that means technically is that you cannot have equality of opportunity between men and women and equality of outcome. It's not possible. And as far as I'm concerned, the science on that is virtually settled. There was a paper published in Science last week. They made an index of wealth and egalitarianism and correlated that with the magnitude of differences between male and female preference and calculated a correlation coefficient of 0.67, if I remember correctly, which is a larger correlation coefficient than is typical of 99.5% of all published social science studies. Right, large sample, and it was the third replication of the same phenomenon in the last month. And so even the London Times said, well, this is now one of the most well-documented facts in all of the social sciences. And maybe you're not happy with that fact. So you say, well, the social sciences are pseudosciences, and we'll just throw them out. It's like, fine, if that's the price you want to pay to cling desperately to your thorough social constructionist ideology, then go right ahead. But the price you pay it isn't just the social sciences that you're going to throw out, it's also the biological sciences. And it seems to me that that's a heavy price to pay to hold on to an axiom that's of very little use anyways. So of course things are socially constructed, obviously, but there's a big difference between partly and completely, and that's the difference between someone who's sensible and informed and someone who's ideologically rigid to the core, and for reasons that they don't even understand. I mean, the fundamental reason, the only reason you'd claim that all the differences between men and women are socially constructed would be if you were the sort of person who wished to remake human beings in the image of your ideological preferences. And that's what's driving the insistence. And if you're the sort of person who thinks that your redesign of human beings would make them better, then you're also the sort of person that other people should get away from very, very rapidly.
I'm not quite sure how to come back from that one. But what I do appreciate is that there's a lot of nuance behind your argument, and I feel that...
That's the problem with it.
And I think I would agree, and I think that on YouTube or other social media platforms, you'll often see some of your work titled sort of Jordan Peterson destroys transgender professor, or those 7 times Jordan Peterson went beast mode. Mm-hmm. So... Whilst seemingly trivial examples, I wonder if you ever worry that your work is being received in this way, and whether your sort of public enunciations sort of provide an intellectual framework for more extreme views?
Well, I don't worry about the latter because I don't think that they do. I do worry about the former. I mean, but I worry about the way I deal with it when I worry about it is by putting out my own content on YouTube in detailed form, and by traveling around and talking to people and saying what I have to say. And I mean, people, you can have no control over what people do with the editing process. Although I would say the most egregious forms of misediting of my work have actually been done by journalists and not by like amateurs on YouTube who are putting together beast mode videos, And then some of that's driven as well by by amateurishness, I would say, and some of it's driven by the desire to attract attention through clickbait, which is something that almost anyone who's looking for views, including the mainstream media, is guilty of. So it's a problem, but I'm addressing it in the only way that I can see fit, which is to put long-form, unedited dialogue in real time online. I mean, one of the things I did at the University of Toronto, which I actually quite enjoy doing in a perverse way, is that, when people, when the university sent their first letters telling me to shut down, essentially, well, the first letter, it's quite a comical story, my chair handed it to me and I read it and I said, "You shouldn't give me this letter." And she said, "Why?" I said, "Well, it's full of inaccuracies and it's not very well written. You should do this properly. You should get your story straight. And if you're going to come after me, it's like, have some class, for God's sake. I told her, bring this letter back to the committee and have them write it properly and then give it to me." And she said, "Well, no, we're not going to do that." And I thought, oh, well, it's your funeral. So I read it on YouTube. And no commentary, I just read it. And then they sent me the second one. I read that too. It's like, I'm perfectly willing to put things right out there in the open and see how they go. And then people do what they will with the content on video, but there's no control over that. I think the idea that that's feeding right-wing viewpoints in some sense is like a perverse dream of the collectivist radicals that I'm not particularly fond of, because I don't think they have a shred of evidence for that. But it'd be very convenient if it was true. I mean, if you come to my lectures, the public lectures, there's almost nothing political about them. I'm not talking about political things. Most of the time, I'm talking about psychological matters. And what I'm trying to do is to help people put their lives together in a productive and responsible way. And all the people that come and talk to me after the lectures, and it's 150 people per lecture, and so that's been, 10,000 people, they all tell me the same thing. It's one variant it's one of two variants. One is, here's a variety of ways that I was having significant trouble in my life. Here's what I've done as a consequence of listening to your lectures to put my life together. It's way better. Thank you. And it's funny to have people tell you those stories, and they don't take long, because I'm meeting people quite quickly, but they're the sorts of stories that you only tell someone that you're intimate with. I mean, first of all, there's a bit of a confessional element. Here's how I had been falling apart, which is a painful thing to admit, especially to a stranger. But what's even more painful to admit often for people is their assent, because it's not easy to find people who you can tell good news to that will listen. And so they tell me their dissolution of their dissolution, and then of their reconstruction, and I'm dead thrilled to hear it, because as far as I'm concerned, everybody who's on the straight and narrow is like one major success, a major accomplishment, and so I'm thrilled to hear it, and so that's what the lectures are like. And if anybody has that confused with incitement of the alt-right, then, well, that's their problem, man, because nothing could possibly be further from what's happening. So, and it's partly also the consequence of the fact that, well, so many journalists are politician wannabes, but they're not, and so they're resentful about that. And all they can do is view the world in political terms, and you're either on the left or you're on the right, and it's more exciting if you're on the radical left or more exciting if you're on the radical right. And if you're doing something that isn't political, then there's no story. They have no idea how to construe it. So, what kind of strange story is it that touring psychologist helps, at least in principle, guides, I want to get that right exactly, provides information for people so that they can put their lives together. It's like, that's not the story you read in a newspaper, because that isn't how newspapers work, but that's what's happening. And so I'm not the least bit. I was thinking about it the other day, because I was on this show, Skavlan in Norway, and they did a little intro, and they said, Jordan Peterson attracts men to his talks. It's like, oh, that's scandalous. Oh no, he's talking to men. That's a terrible thing. And what I've been doing, because you get caught up in this, I've been sort of insisting, well, it's not as male-dominated as you might think. It started out about 80-20, but that's the same proportion of viewership of men to women that you have on YouTube, so there's a base rate phenomenon there, and more women have been attending the lectures since the book has come out. And then I thought the other day, what the hell am I doing? Why am I doing that? It's like, what, you got a problem that young men, and they're not, believe me, they're not all young, That men are coming to listen to me? It's what? Men are not supposed to come to listen to any other men, especially not if they're in the majority. Because there's something wrong if all those men are getting together and listening to each other and talking. God only knows what they're up to. And it's especially bad if they're trying to get their acts together, because you never know what they'll get up to if they got their acts together. So it's like, I'm done with that. It's like if it happens to be a preponderance of men that come and listen to me, then so be it. That's good. I'm thrilled to talk to them. And part of the reason that men are coming and talk to me and tell me these things that I think sometimes they haven't even told their best friends is because I am dead thrilled that they're getting their acts together. I think it's a wonderful thing. You know, I tell people in my lectures, it's like, you have to get your act together. Why? Because you leave a hole in the fabric of reality that you could have filled with something that you could bring into the world that would be great. And what that will be filled with in the absence of that is something terrible. And that's on you. Get it together. And I believe that because I looked at what happened psychologically during the reign of the totalitarian terrorists. And a huge part of what happened was that individuals abdicated their individual ethical responsibility. And they let hell emerge as a consequence. And that happened. It's indisputable. And so that doesn't need to happen again. And the way you stop that from happening, as far as I'm concerned, being a psychologist, is to get your act together so that you're the sort of person that won't be attracted by totalitarian blandishments. You have something better to do. You have something productive to do. You're a sovereign citizen. You've taken your proper place. You're immune to that sort of pathological resentment, cult-like murderous behavior. And so that's what I'm trying to do, is to fortify people, to help them fortify themselves. That's a better way of putting it. And as far as I'm concerned, all the evidence suggests that that's working. And anyone who thinks that's some kind of alt-right phenomenon, well, they can have their pet theory and run with that in their life and see how that works out. Because my suspicions are it's not going to work out very well. So there's that.
Thank you very much for that. So I'd imagine in terms of trying to sort of set yourself on the right path, it would require you to recognize any mistakes or things that may have not quite gone so well. So have you ever been gravely wrong about something? And if so, what? Where you sort of changed your mind quite significantly?
You mean in my entire life? Or do you mean recently?
Maybe sort of more recently.
What have I been gravely wrong about recently? I called the MGTOW people pathetic weasels. And I think that was a little on the harsh side. I don't know if that constitutes grave wrong. I mean, some of them have their points, and so I thought that was a bit harsh. I don't think that I've been particularly gravely wrong about anything that I've said over the last 2 years, but that's mostly because I've only said things that I've thought through very carefully. I'm constantly revising what I think, and so those are micro corrections, but there's many of them. I use my lectures. I always give a different lecture every night, and I always use my lectures to revisit what I'm thinking and to retool it, you know, at the phrase level or the sentence level or the paragraph level, or trying to resort the ideas above the paragraph level so that they're tighter and they're more robust and they constitute a more solid foundation, and maybe they're more elegant, all of that. And so I would say that if you continually engage in appropriate micro-corrections, then you don't have to have the catastrophe of a major error. It's not like I don't think I could make one. I mean, I've come close on Twitter because Twitter rewards, you know, major errors and punishes them. So, but, you know, I think I told Pankaj Mishraj, I think that's his name, journalist, that if he was nearby, I read his article, that I'd happily slap him. And, you know, maybe that was true, and it remains true, by the way. And I thought about it before I hit send, but, and maybe that was an error, but perhaps it wasn't. So I didn't like what he said, and I think that if he had been on the right-hand side of the political spectrum, he would have been taken down and out because of what he said, that I was romancing the noble savage. It's like, really? Really? He had no idea the relationship that he was talking about, nor did he care. But I do truly believe that had he been a conservative commentator, he would have been summarily dismissed from his position for daring to make such an accusation. So I think the idea that I would have happily slapped him was kind of minor in comparison. So, you know, I have some bit of a temper, and maybe I don't always control it as well as I could, but it's hard to tell how much of it to keep under wraps and how much to let out. And keeping all of it under wraps is the wrong amount. So.
Thank you very much for that insight. I think that's about enough from me, because I'm sure there'll be many questions from the audience. So if you could just raise your hand and wait for a steward to come to you with a microphone. So there's a hand right there at the back that went up very, very quickly there.
Drought, flooding, and ocean acidification, unanticipated for 65 million years, all result from climate change, according to over 700 of your fellow scientists. So I was wondering whether you thought climate change could be an issue that could unite us all on left and right, moving us beyond debates about C16 to discussions at the UN at Katowice next month, where perhaps humanity might finally discover its global map of meaning.
No. I mean, there's a couple of reasons. I mean, the first reason is that I spent a lot of time reading. I worked for a UN committee for 2 years on sustainable economic and ecological development, and read a very large amount during that period of time and learned a lot, much of which made me much more optimistic than I had been before I read the relevant literature, which was a real shock to me. But the climate change issue is an absolutely catastrophic, nightmarish mess, and the idea that that will unite us that's not going to unite us. I mean, first of all, it's very difficult to separate the science from the politics, and second, even if the claims, the more radical claims, are true, we have no idea what to do about it. And so, no. And besides, it's even worse than that. Here's one of the worst things about the whole mess is, so as you project outwards with regards to your climate change projections, which are quite unreliable to begin with, and the unreliability of the measurement magnifies as you move forward in time, obviously, because the errors accumulate. And so if you go out 50 years, the error bars around the projections are already so wide that we won't be able to measure the positive or negative effects of anything we do right now. So how in the world are you going to solve a problem when you can't even measure the consequence of your actions? Like, how is that even possible? And besides that, well, what's the solution? What are we going to do? Switch to wind and solar? Well, good luck with that. Just try it and see what happens. We can't store the power. Germany tried it. They produced more carbon dioxide than they did when they started because they had to turn on their coal-fired plants again. That wasn't a very good plan. Well, we don't want nuclear. It's like, okay, what happens at night? The sun goes down. Well, isn't that something we should have taken into account? Well, we got to flip on the coal-fired plants. Well, so it was a complete catastrophe, and all that happened was the price of electricity shot up. There's like zero utility. So that's not a solution. So what are we going to do about it? Well, we should cut back. We can't consume as much as we are all consuming. It's like, well, maybe, except the data that I've read indicate that if you can get the GDP of people up to about $5,000 a year, then they start caring about the environment, and the environment cleans up. So you could make a perfectly strong case, I think, and a reasonable one, perhaps even a humane one, that the actual idea would be to get everybody in the world who's poor, desperately so, out of poverty as fast as possible, which would increase consumption in the short term, because then they'd start to care about the environment and things would clean up. It's like, okay, well, what are we going to do about global warming? Well, good luck figuring that out. I don't see a solution on the horizon. I look at Bjorn Lomborg's work. I really like Bjorn Lomborg. I think he's a real genius. You can look him up if you want. He took the UN millennial goals. There's 200 of them. That's way too many goals if you're serious about goals, by the way, because 200 goals isn't a plan. It's a wish list. You have to prioritize. I'm serious. You have to prioritize. But they won't prioritize because each of the goals has its constituents. And if you prioritize, then you irritate the constituents. But if you don't prioritize, then you can't implement the plan. So what Lomborg did was gather teams of economists, multiple teams, some of whom were Nobel Prize-winning economists. He had them assemble teams. He had them rank order development goals in terms of their return on investment, all of the teams. Then he averaged across the teams and came up with a final list. And addressing global warming wasn't even on the list. The most fundamental, he wrote a book called How to Spend $75 Billion to Make the World a Better Place, and that's not very much money on a global scale. Almost everything that he recommended had to do with increased child nutrition in developing countries. It's like, these things are complicated, man. These are complicated. It's like, well, let's fix global warming. It's like, okay, well, good luck with that. First of all, how are you going to do that? And to think that will unite us, well, certainly not uniting us so far. So, no. And it's the kind of low-resolution thinking that just gets us absolutely nowhere. I like what Lomborg did way better. I think it's way more intelligent. So, maybe if you increase child nutrition enough and you produce another, I don't know, 10 million geniuses as a consequence of that, and maybe one of them will figure out what to do about global warming. Well, I'm serious about that, It's not a bad thing to increase the total sum of human brain power, And so we treat these things so lightly. Well, let's fix the planet. Well, we're going to concentrate on global warming. Well, why global warming? Well, because everyone thinks that's the biggest catastrophe. Well, maybe it is, but if you don't have a solution, well, and then what about all those other problems? What are you going to do about them? Well, we'll ignore them because we can feel good about, being concerned about global warming. It's like, one of the reasons, there's more trees in the Northern Hemisphere than there were 100 years ago. No one knows that, but it's true, and by a substantial margin. You know why, in part? Because people burned coal instead of wood. It's like everyone says, well, we shouldn't burn coal. It's like, okay, fair enough. What do you want to do? Burn trees instead? Because that's what poor people would have done. It's like, coal isn't good. Well, it's better than burning wood. So these things are complicated. So they're unbelievably complicated. And so, no, it's not going to unite us. And we're not going to do a damn thing about it either. So it doesn't really matter. So, well, what are we going to do? You're going to stop, having heat? You're going to stop having electricity? You're going to stop driving your cars? You're going to stop taking trains? It's like, you're going to stop using your iPhones? You're not going to do any of that. And no wonder. So, no.
Thank you for that. Just over here.
Dr. Peterson, first of all, I'd just like to say a massive thank you for coming down today, and also for your positive message, because I think it's really helped a lot of people out, because it's not just saying you're a victim, you should feel sorry for yourself. There's something immensely powerful in the fact that you say you can sort yourself out, and with something as simple as clean your own room, which I think is a great motto, by the way, and really helps me when I'm sort of stressed and, with deadlines and things.
Your mother
Clean
must
your
have
room
told you
first.
that.
That's true, many times.
Yeah, she probably didn't tell you why, though. That's the thing.
But I really appreciate that, first of all. But where my question's going with that is, afterwards you say, once you've sorted yourself out in some way, got your own house in order, you should try and sort of sort your family out and sort other people out. And I think at the moment we have a real problem with people who are overly stressed and people who have issues with depression and things. So I was wondering, how would you say is the best way to support friends and family who are going through times of depression and stress when you've sort of got yourself in order? But then what's the best way to sort of help them get through that time? Because there's only so much you can do.
To listen.
To listen.
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, first of all, you want to be as good an example as you can. That's helpful, because then at least someone who's depressed and struggling can see that someone is making it. That's helpful. If you're drowning and you see someone swimming, then you can think that swimming might work. Maybe you remember to swim even, But listening, there's almost nothing better that you can do with people, period, than to listen to them. First of all, they need to know what the problem is. So if you have someone who's suffering around you, it's like, okay, what the hell's your problem? Exactly. Well, I'm in pain. Well, let's hear some reasons why. You're going to have to flounder about, while you're guessing why you're miserable. Now and then you're in a bad mood and you can't tell why. Maybe you snap at the person you love and they say, well, what's up with you? And you don't really know. You're in a bad mood. And then you figure out it was something your boss said to you 2 days ago. That's short-term ignorance. If you're depressed and in a very bad spot, it might take you a very long time to articulate the reasons. And so that's helpful, just to have someone who will listen and allow you to suffer at the same time. Because a lot of what happens if you're trying to listen to someone who's in trouble is you want to produce premature closure for the suffering because it's unbearable, and you can't. You just have to listen to the person suffer. And that's okay in some sense, because that's their destiny. Not that it's not terrible, I'm not saying that, but you can detach from that. It's like, what do you think the problem is? What's going on in your life? What might it be? Well, I don't know. Well, guess. What could it be? Flounder about a bit. Let's get the cards on the table here. Well, that helps people figure out what the problem might be and what it isn't. Well, that's a start. Then you can maybe discuss what a potential solution might look like, but people have to formulate that themselves. So don't underestimate the utility of listening. And there's very many people who never have anyone listen to them ever. And it's really hard on them. They can't sort out their minds without talking, because that's how most people think. In fact, that's really how everyone thinks, although some people can also think on their own. It's very rare. So mostly we think by talking. So never underestimate the utility of listening. It's unbelievably helpful to people. So, and they tell you all sorts of interesting things then. People are ridiculously interesting if you listen to them, because they're so peculiar. You know, they're so strange and idiosyncratic. And one of the things I loved about being a clinical psychologist is it was like, and I did, some of my days were 13 hours long, you know, one person after another. It was like being in a Dostoevsky novel all day. It's like, wow, really? That happened? That happened too? Wow, that's terrible. How do you cope with that? And crazy stories constantly about, you know, familial insanity of various sorts and misbehavior and crazy triumphs and weird goals and ambitions. And so the other thing too is that if you listen, then people get really interesting. So that's fun. So, you know, if you're surrounded by boring people, it's not them, by the way. It's you. Right. Right.
Thank you for that. Just over here.
Hi. One of the, a lot of critics have said that, whether it's valid or not, that a lot of your, studies are sort of pseudo-science, and that a lot of it is just a way for you to, a lot of it is informed by your Christian beliefs. I was hoping if you could, talk about that a bit more, or whether it's not true or not, or whether it's...
Well, the pseudoscience issue, that's pretty damn comical, especially given who it's usually, what would you say, brought forth by. That would be like social constructionist gender studies theorist types. It's like, Jesus, being criticized by that group is like being nibbled to death by ducks from a scientific perspective. You know, it's like, oh, you're criticizing... You're criticizing my science. It's like, well, you don't know anything about science. You don't know anything about biology. It's like, well, all of that's neo-colonialist element of the tyrannical patriarchy. It's like, okay, fine, throw out the social sciences if that's what you want to do. But what I have, and it's not so much what I've done, although I have done research in gender differences in personality as part of my, what would you call it, research output. We developed a questionnaire called the Big Five Aspect Scale, which is being widely used around the world, which provides what seems to be the highest resolution, psychometrically valid model of personality that's available today. There's contenders, but it's certainly up there in the top 2 or 3. And we've mapped personality differences between men and women. Neutrally, it's like we didn't know what the differences were going to be or whether they showed up or not. But these studies that show that there are differences in temperament and interest between men and women, they are, look, you can say what you want about psychology. You can say, well, it's bunk. Psychometrics is bunk. Well, then you're going to sure get rid of sociology and political science and the economics and so forth, because they are way more methodologically weak than psychology. But maybe you're willing to dispense with them too. But of psychological studies, the personality studies are the most psychometrically solid. They are the most reliable and valid and well replicated. And they indicate that there are differences between men and women. They're not huge, although the differences in interest are quite big, but they're certainly large enough to produce quite a bit of difference at the extremes. And the extremes are where the action is in terms of things like occupational choice. So, and you can say, well, that's pseudoscience, and you can say, I'm a pseudoscientist, but what that means is that you have to say that about all the social sciences. And if you want to do that, and it's not like people cavil at doing that. I mean, we have critics who say that the entire scientific enterprise is nothing but what neo-colonial outgrowth of the Eurocentric, patriarchal, tyrannical worldview, and it's really been imposed as a way of continuing the oppression narrative or something like that. It's like, fine, if you can do that, There's a price to be paid for it, and there's usually a performative contradiction involved too, because all the people who purport not to believe in science are still perfectly happy to utilize all the crazy gadgets that the scientists have produced, and so they seem to believe in science well enough to do things like fly in airplanes and use their iPhones, and that's actually an indication of their belief in the theories upon which the technologies are predicated, but that sort of internal coherence is too much for the typical postmodernist. And with regards to my pseudoscience status as a psychologist, I'm a perfectly, what would you say? I'm a perfectly credible research psychologist. I'm well cited, my papers are published in good journals, and I've spent 30 years trying to figure out what the most reliable measurements are in psychology. Because I got obsessed with that in the 1990s when I found out that so much of what psychologists were measuring wasn't real, which the psychologists all figured out, by the way, about 4 years ago. And so I went for the core. It's like, what's reliable? What can we measure? We can measure IQ. That doesn't mean that we're happy about it, that's for sure, but we can measure it. What else can we measure? Looks like we can measure personality with something approximating a 5-dimensional structure. I wasn't happy about that. I thought it was a theory that was as dull as dishwater. Ditchwater? Dishwasher? Whatever. Either of those. They're all equally dull. It was a theory without romance as far as I was concerned. I'm quite interested in psychoanalytic theories, for example. But the brute power of the statistical processes that produced the models is undeniable. And it has high predictive validity. I mean, the best predictor of your life outcome, the best psychometric predictor is IQ. The second best is conscientiousness. And they're powerful predictors. They still leave about between 50 to 75% of your life outcome, economically speaking, to random factors that can't be measured, which is a lot, but as far as what we can measure goes, they're very powerful predictors. And so they can wave the pseudoscience flag all they want. It's not going to help. Unless, as I said, you want to throw out the entire edifice. It's like, go ahead. You don't think the social sciences are worth anything? It's like, dispense with them. We're trying to do that anyways. And the radical types are doing the same thing to the STEM fields. They're after them like you cannot believe, especially in the United States. So we don't like the results, therefore the entire enterprise is suspect. Okay, it's not wise. And what the hell's the problem? What, there's no differences between men and women? We're actually going to believe that? So here's a better theory, and this is what's supported by the facts. There are differences in interest and preference between men and women. You eradicate the sociocultural differences by making your society more egalitarian. The biological differences maximize. Okay, what's the problem? Men and women get to choose what they want to do. They don't choose the same things. Is that a problem? What are you going to do? Force them? Because that is what you're going to do. Well, when are you going to start? When they're in kindergarten? And how are you going to do that? Especially if the differences are large. You're going to do that in a relatively tyrannical way. Yeah, it's about time the damn lobsters showed up. They didn't do that at Oxford. So, I'm serious about this. It's like, let's say you're a feminist, okay? What is it that you want as a feminist? Do you want all women to be the same and all of them to be exactly the same as all men? Or do you want to let the cards fall where they're going to and let people make free choice? It's like, it isn't obvious to me which of those is more commensurate with the ideologically pure and virtuous version of feminism. As far as I'm concerned, there's differences between men and women in interest, especially in interest, because women tilt towards interest in people and men tilt towards interest in things. And that drives occupational differentiation. And it maximizes in the Scandinavian countries. It's like, well, what are you going to do about that? It's not true. It's like, yeah, sorry, it's true. Well, we don't know what to do about that. Oh, the whole science is suspect. It's like, maybe your damn theory is suspect. I mean, that's a possibility. It might be worth thinking about it before you throw everything else out. What are you going to replace that with? Judith Butler's sociocultural theory? Well, good luck founding your existence on that. So, pseudoscience, Jesus.
Just a question just over there.
Jordan, thanks very much for your talk. I was just wanting to follow up on something that you just said about the fact that men and women tilt towards different interests, and that informs their outcomes in terms of their jobs. I wonder why you think it is that it seems that most economies in the world seem to privilege, in terms of the sorts of pay that people will get, those types of jobs that seem to cater more for those things that men tilt more towards. Why is it that...
Oh, sure, that's a good question.
Why shouldn't we be more like women and attach more value to that? Why is it that it seems that men get...
Well, there's lots of things that are valuable that we have a really hard time attaching monetary value to. It's really hard to monetize childcare. And the reason for that is that the economic payoff is delayed by decades. We don't know how to monetize things where the economic payoff is delayed by decades. We don't have the technology. So it's a very big technical problem. How do you make having children economically productive? Well, we don't know the answer to that because we don't have the long-term economic structures that enable monetization of that. So, maybe your kids aren't capable of being monetized till they're like 40, but certainly till they're in their mid-20s. So that's a long-term investment. A venture capitalist, they want a 10-time return on their money within the first 5 years. You're not getting that with kids, that's for sure. And so the problem isn't the structure of capitalism. The problem is the protracted dependency period of human beings, and the fact that a primary part of that load falls on women. And we don't have a gender pay gap. We have a mother pay gap if we want to get, precise enough about it to actually try to start to solve it. And that's a real problem because women do take a hit for having kids. But it isn't exactly clear what we should do about that. It's not like we know. It's the eternal problem of the human race. How do you generate enough resources so that people can have children in relative security and opportunity? That's a big problem. Okay, so that's that part of the answer. But the other part is, well, why is there a gender pay gap in favor of men? Well, first of all, it's mostly the mother issue. But even if it isn't that, there are other factors. It's a lot easier to monetize interest in things, partly because you can scale it. It's like, let's say you're doing nursing care. Well, what are you going to do? One nurse to 100 people? That doesn't work. Now, if you're building a thing, like I have a company, we build software. There's like 3 of us have done it for 20 years. 3. And we've probably provided services to 400,000 people. Well, that's scalable, And the thing about a lot of thing-oriented enterprises is that they're scalable. Childcare is not scalable at all, As soon as you scale it, children start to suffer. I worked for a daycare branch of the Alberta Social Services. That was the province that I grew up in, and I helped them draft back years ago their regulations for early childhood care. And the fundamental psychological recommendations were if the children in daycare were under 3, that there was no more than 3 children per adult. Well, try monetizing that. All you have to do is the mathematics. It's like, okay, let's do it. Let's say you want to train childcare professional. So what's that going to cost? Well, let's pay them miserably, but reasonably. £20,000 a year. Okay, so that's £7,000 per child. Okay, so double that for the infrastructure, so that's £14,000 per year per child. And that's just for basic care. It's like, well, who's going to make enough money to afford that? For many people, if they're working, especially let's say you have 3 kids, it's like £52,000 a year. Well, you don't even make that much money. We don't know how to monetize it. It's not anybody's fault. Now, there's other reasons why men make more money than women. They work longer hours, on average. You work 10% longer hours, you make 40% more money. So that's something you should all know, by the way, if you go out and get a job. 10% longer hours, 40% more money. That's a hell of a return on investment. It's good to be the person who comes to work 15 minutes early and leaves half an hour late. It will disproportionately reward you. Now, maybe that's harder for women because they often have to go home and take care of the kids. And so, the point of the issue is that part of the disproportion is working hours. Men work outside more. They work in more dangerous jobs. They're more likely to move. They work in scalable industries. They are more likely to take STEM field jobs, which pay more. It's like those are all relevant issues. So And it isn't clear exactly what to do about that. You know, I mean, if you can scale your job, then it actually generates more income, so you make more money. Or you think, well, we should pay women more for childcare. Well, who's going to pay? Other people with children? Like, we don't have the answers. And to say, well, and hand wave and go, well, it's a consequence of the tyrannical patriarchy. It's like, sorry, that's of zero utility. It's nothing. It just sounds like you know something to yourself, but it's not helpful. These are intractable problems. And actually, we've done a pretty damn good job of solving them, I would say. You know, like it's been a huge influx of women into every realm of society in the last 50 years. I mean, how fast do you think these things can happen? We can barely adjust to the rate of change as it is. And so it's happening all over the world at a tremendous rate. Like birth rates are plummeting everywhere. Women are being educated at an extraordinarily rapid rate. It'd be nice to speed it up, but Jesus, it's moving pretty quickly. It's like, I don't see the problem precisely. Everything isn't exactly equal for everyone. Well, yeah, that's for sure. And believe me, any attempt to eliminate that will produce far more problems than it will solve. So, there you go.
I think we might just take one very, very short question, so just over here. Yes.
So as society moves away from like Christian values, as you said, and you like the views of Nietzsche, for example, who says that will be replaced by ideologies, so totalitarian ideologies.
And hopelessness, don't forget hopelessness.
Yeah. So now that the West has been through those totalitarian ideologies, what happens next, do you think? What's the most likely outcome? Because do we stick with another ideology, and if so, what ideology will that be?
No, I don't think so. I think it's back to the past for resurrection, so to speak.
To Christianity?
Yeah, well, who knows exactly, but, you know, Jung was a very astute critic of Nietzsche, and there aren't very many because Nietzsche was very, very smart, and so you criticize him at your peril. But Nietzsche believed that one potential move forward would be that we could create our own values. But the psychoanalysts, and I would say the biologically oriented psychologists in large part, philosophers as well, have pretty much eradicated that as a possibility because you can't create your own values. I mean, go try. You can do it as an exercise tomorrow morning. It's like you're going to sit down, blank slate that you are, free choice creature that you are, and you're going to create your own values. It's like, well, you're going to lose 30 pounds, maybe that's the first thing, and you're going to reshape your physique by going to the gym 3 times a week, and you're going to start eating properly, and no more of that alcoholic binging or pot smoking, that's out, and you're not going to play any more video games, and you're not going to waste any more time. And you're creating those values, and you lay them out, and then bang, from then on in, that's all you do, is you obey yourself 100%, because you've told yourself to do it. It's like, does that sound like life? Has that ever happened to anyone in the history of the human race? It's like, no, you can't enforce, you're not your own slave, you're not your own puppet. And maybe it would be easier if you were, although you might tell yourself something stupid and go do it, which wouldn't be such a good thing. So you have to contend with your own soul, and that has a structure, that soul, and that's partly what the psychoanalysts laid out, and I think Jung did that most effectively. If you want to establish values in the face of the death of the past, which is something that's happened many times, not merely in the late 19th century, you have to look inside and discover what those values are. And that is truly a process of discovery. Like, to find out what's meaningful in your life is to take yourself seriously as a mystery. It's like there is something that will grip you. And it might not even be what you choose. In fact, sometimes it's not what now and then you fall in love with the wrong person. You go home and you tear your hair out. It's like, what the hell's wrong with me? How can I do this? It's like, well, you're pulled by forces that are beyond your control. They're deeply, deeply enmeshed inside you. You have to discover who you are. And you do that partly in university. You do that partly with literature. And you do that partly with dreams and visions and all of the acts of the imagination. And you negotiate with yourself to find out, where are the values? Where is firm ground for me? And how can I launch myself forward? And that is an archaeological expedition, because you are excavating the values of the past, even if you're doing that psychologically. Now, hopefully, if you're in a great university, you do that in tandem with excavating the values of the past intellectually. And so then there's a dance between your own soul, your own imaginative soul, and the manifestations of the soul across time. It speeds your development along, but it's still a matter of discovering what it means to be human. And that's not something that's simply invented. It's not that at all. You only believe that if you want to remake men and women in the image of your ideology. It's like you're something you have to contend with. Just like if you have a partner, a romantic partner, it's like they're there. You have to contend with them. You have to negotiate a solution. You have to jointly establish your values on some real basis, and you have to do the same thing with yourself. And the idea will be, and I believe this to be true, is that when you discover what your values are, you'll find an affinity between those values and the great ideas of the past. Because why wouldn't you? They were also produced by human beings who were struggling. And then you get a concordance between your soul and the past. And then you've started to become who you actually are. You know, you've reinvigorated the dead father and incorporated it. And that makes you who you could be. And that makes you able to live. And that's a good replacement. Well, it's not even a replacement. It's a rediscovery of the original doctrine. And so we can't let this go. Because the alternative is a nihilism that turns into something catastrophic, or an ideology that's a weak replacement. It's still a religion. It's just an unbelievably shallow and unidimensional religion with none of the grandeur, none of the transcendence, none of the mystery, none of the beauty, none of that. It's just stripped bare, fragmentary religion that you can understand in a week and then convince yourself of the superiority of your arrogant intellect. It's not helpful. So, the Jungian critique, Freud as well. No, you can't create your own values. You have to discover who you are. And you do that painfully because you're not your own puppet. You have a nature. And you have to act in accordance with that. And so, well, so that's your destiny if you choose to accept it. Mission impossible. Yeah.
Thank you very much for that, Professor Peterson, and thank you very much for your time. If you could all join me in giving him a very warm round of applause. If you'd like to get a copy of your book signed, could you please remain in the chamber afterwards, and we'll try and Charles will coordinate that effort. Just in terms of the week ahead, we're hosting Manny Pacquiao next Tuesday and Slavoj Žižek and Omarosa on Friday. So I look forward to seeing you next week, and have a lovely weekend. Thank you very much.